decision. Oh, animated voice. Anyone want to respond to that? Yeah.
Decision making.
Yeah, that's what seems like it doesn't belong there, right? Like you think of that picture of those people sitting in the arena. They're making a decision, they're making decisions, and I'm going to try and defend this idea, though not real aggressively, that there's actually decision making going on even in that audience, in that kind of audience. Anyone else want to, is that what you were going to say? Yeah, it's the idea of decision making. Now, this also, I want to suggest, raises the stakes quite a bit on the component of audience in the public discourse arena. And I would really think we'd be better off, personally, culturally, if we were a little more attuned to the audience's role and a little less attentive to the speaker or source's role. And so let's see if I can make the case for that today. Okay, now that's, I'm trying to do two things at once. Okay, so I think this raises a rhetorical paradox because we're all very wedded to the idea of freedom of speech as Americans, and well, we should be First Amendment rights. And I'd like someone to read that top paragraph, while we protect the expression of speakers. Could someone read that for us? Beverly's going to read it up here. Oh, okay. We could do it in tandem.
While we protect.
You got a microphone, Beverly.
Oh. While we protect the expression of speakers, writers, and individual members of the public, we do not have complementary rules protecting audiences from manipulation and false information.
So let's just pause there for a minute. Is that a true statement? I mean, I'm suggesting that. You look at the Constitution, venerable document, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. In fact, the assembly part we don't talk about too much. And I'm wondering if that's where audience kind of sneaks in there a little bit in the framers thinking about. What is your reaction to that statement? Does that seem like a true statement? Yes, sir. Oh. This may not save you many steps, as it turns out, Amy.
What comes to mind is the unfolding discussion about social media, and whether or not those who kind of enter into the social media circumstance should be protected from misinformation, or whether TikTok or any of them should be circumscribed to insist upon truth to protect the audience from being exposed to misinformation. And my impression is that that's an increasing kind of place of significant dialogue, if not disagreement.
Yeah, we're not ready for it. It exploded onto the scene. Facebook today has approximately 4 billion subscribers. That's half the human race. That took about 20 years. So yeah, we have not really, just in that one arena of social media, come anywhere close to coming up with some protections. Anyone else want to comment? Does it sound like an overstatement? Let's read the second one. That is, we do not formulate. And I'm going to ask for a volunteer to read again. Would you like to read? What is your name?
It's Bob.
Bob, okay.
That is, we do not formulate principles protecting the public in its role as audience from abuses such as conspiracy theories, lies, disinformation, extreme hyperbole, false narratives, and other intentionally misleading strategies.
And I think when you put the word intentionally in there, which I intentionally did, you realize you have to realize there's a moral weight and a moral responsibility to what's going on, even in what Bob was talking about with social media. We don't formulate principles protecting the public in its role as audience. As much as I've thought about it, I think that's still a true statement. Does anybody want to comment on that? We just, yeah. Is it, what is your name?
I'm George.
George, okay.
George. Yeah, it just strikes me with the issue of freedom of speech, where we're kind of one way about it.
Yeah.
So you could be standing up in some forum, spinning all sorts of stuff, and I could get up and challenge you.
Mm-hmm.
And you might object that I'm interfering with your right to free speech.
Well, yeah, that's one way in which the power imbalance shows itself. The audience is sort of supposed to be very deferential to that speaker or that panel. And I actually, it's that kind of thing I want to try and flip the page on a little bit today, flip the equation. Yeah, Beverly?
I'm thinking of too is that, or maybe I'm asking a question, is the press supposed to be the role of challenging what, versus just reporting what they hear or see happening? Are they also supposed to be challenging so that we are in some way protecting an audience from manipulation and false information? Is that not the role of the press?
I think it is a role of the press. And I think that if we have to be careful that we don't think, and that's done because the press are taking care of it. But I think, and you can see the press does both things that you're talking about, but it also brings up the risk of, and I'm not attributing this phrase to anyone in particular, fake news. As soon as you say that, you have compromised the role of the press, at least in my book. And anyone else want to comment or respond to anyone in the press in the room? Anyone member of the press? I'd be curious to know in terms of journalistic ethics, how they define that role. But I think probably both things that you mentioned are they would consider in their domain. But I want the general public to also think of themselves in that role as well. Yeah.
When we say the press, there are a lot of presses around.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
So it's a choice of press.
Yeah. What is the press? And this is the proverbial can of worms. But I don't have much background in journalism and who is considered the press. But you're right; it's very diverse and very huge. And as Bob has already pointed out, when you bring in the social media, where do they land? And okay, so let's. And I'm not moving on because I think it's a risk to stay on one of these points and talk it through all the way, but because we've got more things I'd like to cover. But okay, so we all belong to audiences. This also, I think sometimes when we talk about an audience, you might think, well, that's some people who go out and listen to speakers and watch presentations, and I don't do that. Well, I think you do. In a democracy, each of us belongs to the audience of citizens, and as citizens to the audience of voters. Would you accept that statement? Someone want to read that second paragraph as voters? We talked about decision making. This is one of the places I want to bring in the fact of decision making. What is your name? Suzanne, could you read the bottom paragraph for us there?
Read the last.
Yeah.
As voters, we are asked to make extraordinarily important decisions, such as who our office holders will be, albeit without even informal protection.
Without even informal protection. I mean, not even a culture of protection, let alone laws, rules, regulations, etc. Someone like to respond to that second paragraph. As voters, we're asked to make extraordinarily important decisions. Now, I said you're in the role of decision making. When you read the newspaper, read an editorial, read a news story, watch the evening news, listen to someone like Joe Biden make a speech on television, do you think of yourself as a decision maker, a voter who's as you're being addressed, you're making decisions? Anyone want to respond to that? Does that sound like an accurate description? Is that how you think of yourself when you're doing that? You're shaking your head. No. What is your name? Janet. Oh, it's my wife, Janet, right there. Okay. More than one Janet in the room is always a good thing.
It just doesn't occur. It just doesn't
You don't think
generally
about it that
occur to
way.
me
Don't
that
think-
I'm
right.
in the process of making a decision, though I agree with you. I am.
Yeah, you are. And that raises the stakes again. If I lie to you, and when you're trying to make that decision, to me, that's kind of what opened my eyes to this. Originally, someone said, well, the reason a public lie is so potent and so dangerous is because these people are making decisions that are very consequential. So if you're lying to them, you're giving them disinformation within the process of decision making, and we depend on that. Anyone else want to comment on this idea that even who we're voting for as an office holder, I had the word leader in there and I took it out because I think if I use the word leader instead of office holder, it biases this again back in favor of the speaker or source. That's the leader. I must be a follower. And as you can kind of tell, I'm trying to get us to think of it maybe the other way around. The people who have the power are the people sitting there in that audience. Yeah, Bob.
This is probably just tangential, but what comes to mind is that remarkable event that happened, a month, 2 months ago, when Trump mentioned at one of his rallies that he had been vaccinated and it elicited an enormous amount of boos.
Yeah.
And what I didn't think of it at that particular time, but it comes to mind given what you're saying. They were presuming a power that up to that particular point in most of the Trump rallies, I don't think he presumed that the crowd had, that indeed there was a display of the power of the people who were listening that gave pushback to him that I think was probably unsettling to him and a shock to many of us.
That's a good example. And one of the reasons, of course, that this all became relevant again is because of Trump's style of oratory, which is very unidirectional. And I agree, when the crowd started booing, it was a shock to him and a shock to a lot of people in the press. Now he's getting some pushback, but that's not very articulate pushback. It's just to boo somebody, right? At least says, I don't agree with you, but not much more than that. Anyone else want to comment on this idea? Yeah, go ahead, Suzanne.
Wait a minute.
Gotta get Amy as.
This is Suzanne again.
Yeah.
We all make our decision first, though, what we're going to listen to.
Mhm.
I mean, what network do you turn into? Will you accept listening to other things?
Right,
Or
that's
that-
a good
Because
point.
you've already have
Oh,
a
I know. what you're pointing
ingrained
Yeah.
psyche. Of,
And the siloing effect, and yeah. That's why sometimes I challenge my students to listen to Al Jazeera or BBC or some other source they're not used to listening to, because that's right. We tend to, and now we're very focused only on sources that we agree with. That's probably undermining the idea of audience too. Yeah, David?
We have another comment from Zoom. I cannot understand how we can censor the disinformation without setting up some body of deciders. Who is to decide? Who is to be the censors?
Well, yeah, okay, great. I don't have a ready answer to that, but I'm hoping by the end of the presentation to make the case that the general audience is or should be, if they're properly educated. And I think one of the surprise, the professor tells you need more education. But that's where I'm going with this. But yeah, that would kind of defeat the purpose if you had a panel of official censors. Good point. Okay, let's see what's coming up next here. What's that? Oh, well, this is the microphone. Oh, this one. Yes, you're right. Okay, give me that. Okay. Now, what does that say? Oops. I'm trying to track this with my own. Okay. Number one here, these are kind of summary questions that will set the agenda for the rest of the conversation. So what consideration do audiences deserve then from advocates in the public arena? Do we ever even ask ourselves that question? What knowledge do audiences require in order to perform competently the task we assign to them? That's an educational question. The first one is kind of an ethical question. What consideration do audiences deserve from advocates in the public arena? What knowledge do audiences require? An educational question in order to perform competently the task we assign them, which is a question you can ask yourself. Do I feel adequately prepared to be a member of a decision-making audience? And third, in sum, what are the rights of audiences and the corresponding ethical responsibilities of sources toward audiences? Now, it's number three that's really the kind of summary statement and frames what I want to do with all of you today. What are the rights of audiences? So does it sound funny to talk about the rights of audiences, or have you ever heard anybody talk that way? You were shaking your head, no. New concept, but does it sound odd to you?
There used to be a fairness doctrine, wasn't there?
Yeah.
That governed TV, so that's sort of
had to do with the rights of audiences.
Well, actually, you're right. That's kind of history of television at this point, and I don't know where that went, but there was the broadcasters voluntarily signed on to something like that. I got to look that up. I think you're right. We had it at one time. George, you were shaking your head.
Yeah, I just, thinking of that first point, I find myself frustrated, even in political debate, with people that I agree with,
Mhm.
politicians I support, and I find myself kind of saying to myself, don't talk down to me and give me these cliches and talking points. Give me some real information, some real.
So you're kind
Rationale
of
for
answering that
this
question for
and
yourself by that
yeah.
response. But we don't have a
Yeah.
good way, or do we have a good way of getting an answer to that? Which is also the process of improving public discourse.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what an answer to that would be. I mean, in a small forum like this, you can ask.
Yeah.
If it's a mass mailing, an online posting, an advertisement, don't get it.
And I'm going to come back to that and suggest a possible answer a little later on today. Okay, now let me try this. Did that change things? Oh, except okay. Now, here is another kind of summary statement. Evidence-based, audience-centered decision-making is at the heart of a functioning democracy. Let's pause and think about that. I think it may be a reorientation, or maybe this is how you think of it. Evidence-based, audience-centered decision-making is at the heart of any functioning democracy. For this reason, if for no other. Now, I'm getting into the rights of audiences now. I'm going to give you 4. The idea here is everything has an essence, and I'm arguing that, in fact, in the essence of decision-making, and especially in the context of a democracy, nobody would recognize these as established rights of audiences. This is kind of an invention of my own. But what I'm trying to do, the reason for the first paragraph, is to say, here's an essence, an unchanging essence of democracy. Evidence-based, audience-centered decision-making is at the heart of any functioning democracy. For this reason, number 1, right of audiences. Audiences have a right to accurate information, to reliable evidence. Everything in the public domain depends on this right being recognized and honored. I don't think it is being recognized and honored right now in some arenas, but I would like to get a little reaction to this. Audiences have a right to accurate information. What would you say in response? I mean, I'm guessing you would agree, and as an audience member, you'd hope that would be the case. Yeah, Amy?
I feel like at one time we had a little better handle on what the sources of accurate information were. We knew that the National Enquirer in the supermarket line was not a reliable source of information. But now it seems like even the network news is focused on sensationalism more than accuracy.
Raise the question again of how do you know and who decides this kind of thing. Okay, and we'll see where we stand on that by the end of the presentation. I'm not going to answer the question directly, but we'll have a little more to think about, I think. Yes, David?
Yep, there's another comment from Zoom. This person believes that the election of Trump indicates a terrible failure of our educational system. We are not teaching our children how to do any critical thinking. College grads should be able to distinguish truth from lies.
Well, that was pretty much my presentation right there. I agree with all of that. I think we also have to break it down and say, how do we change this then? And believe it or not, I'm committed to that. Yes.
I think the point you brought up goes back to the point George made about people give him talking points, and there are things that grab our attention, and there's not in-depth discussion of issues. Everybody's fighting to get your attention. Thus, they throw out these ridiculous claims or remarkable statements or one-liners.
There's a lot we could say about that in the previous comment, but this gets back to the issue of power too. Somebody has realized that there's more than one way to command the power in a room. And one way is to just make an outrageous statement. how do we counteract that? That's kind of what we're about today. Anyone else have a comment on that? Audiences have. So I am saying, and I'm only going to give you a set of 4, and you might come up with others and say, well, isn't that a right of the audience? Yes, Bob.
This is probably tangential, but what comes to mind, just this past week, I think I heard that the Republican Party has decided to opt out of the national presidential
I was going to
debates.
bring that up. I took it out of the presentation, but say that again, please.
Just that they have decided not to participate in the every 4-year presidential election debate series, which means that in all likelihood, come September, October, those of us in the audience called voters will not have opportunity to listen to candidates debate. And I'm going to be interested to see whether or not people care or not, because there's a part of me that wonders whether or not some people will say no big loss because those experiences have not been helpful, or whether the majority of us will say, no, we've lost here a significant opportunity to be introduced to information that we need to make a wise decision. And I truthfully, I'm torn as to whether or not we will care or not.
Yeah, but at least that was one arena where we kind of tried to level the playing field a little bit and get people into the discussion and hear what they were thinking. Now, again, in my estimation, it's the listeners who are being disabused of power, but by somebody who was a source, that said, it's the people up front who are controlling the power. But if it's the public, as I'm suggesting, this takes that away from the public without consulting the public about it. Anyone else want to comment on this idea that the Republican National Committee basically decided to opt out of the presidential debates, which I think is a tragedy, but there you have it. Okay, let's see, are we? I'm losing track of my. Oh, there we go. Okay.
This is Suzanne again.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if mightn't there be another force of republicanism that could help change it? I had respect for the Republican parties before, but it's waned since Gingrich's time, at least. That
yeah,
their approach is just hurtful.
well, I'm trying to back us out from that very specific focus a little bit and say, okay, so generally speaking, what's wrong here, and what can we do about it? I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I sympathize. In order to get a cultural change, I think you have to do some analysis and back it away and be a little more objective about it. But I understand your concern. Okay, let's see here. Oh, I went the wrong way. That's the problem. Okay. Response making. Okay, I'll read this. Response making is at the heart of rhetorical transactions. Now, a rhetorical transaction, what I have in mind by that, is a two-way, strategically oriented communication setting. Okay, so politics is a good example. Despite our usual privileging of a speaker, public argument ought to be understood as, okay, here's the payoff on this one. Public argument ought to be understood as cooperative, multi-directional. An argument is not unidirectional communication moving only from the source to an audience. Thus, audiences have, and this is the second right I'm suggesting or advocating for today, a right to respond. We ought to affirm a presumption in favor of the audience's right to a response to any message it is asked to accept. Now, Bob's point about the debates being pulled out, I mean, at least you had the opportunity for some kind of audience response. That's been eliminated. What am I getting at here? That this power differential we saw in that second slide with the audience setting there needs to be balanced a little bit with a kind of guaranteed protected right on the part of the audience to respond to any message that they hear. I'd like to get a little reaction to that as well, because the nature, the essence again of rhetorical transactions, which are the heart of our democracy, is it's multi-directional. Anyone want to respond to that? A right to respond, we ought to affirm, would that gum up the works, or should we say, yes, we have to make sure that's being protected? Beverly,
I think that we have the right to respond as an audience to something that you hear. But what I've noticed lately is that when people do respond to something that they've heard, whether they agree or disagree, that if the speaker doesn't like what they hear, they're just, the person who's responding is dismissed as not being important.
yeah, again, I think that's a cultural issue. We've kind of been shaped that way. And if we could maybe change the flow of influence a little bit from speaker to audience, we might be able to change the culture a little bit too. So that wasn't the case. Yes.
I'm Barbara. I think, though, that when you're dealing with a live audience, the person who is responding needs also to have a responsibility to be civil, accurate, and have something to say rather than pure emotional upset.
Okay, that's a very good point. You don't want just a right to respond. It should be a responsible response, right? I don't want to just put this off, but actually I'm hoping to talk about it a little bit next week. But that's a good point. Anyone want to comment on Barbara's point? Well, this used to be called decorum, and the idea of decorum has kind of gone by the wayside like so many things, but a kind of sense of being in public and being responsible in public. That's all I'll say about that. But I think you're right. And we have to think about, well, what do we ask of speakers in that respect? If we're honoring that standard of decorum, what is it going to be? I think one of the things that troubled a lot of people about Trump is he sort of dismissed the whole concept of decorum at the outset, and in a very quick way changed the nature of public discourse just by that one move. Anyone else want to comment? Right to respond, Barbara's saying, in a particular way, otherwise it could be more damaging than helpful. We ought to affirm a presumption in favor of the audience's right to respond to any messages asked to accept. Okay, now see if I can get to number 3 here.
Can I just mention, I was at the Board of Ed meeting on Monday, and they have a time for public comment. They're limited to 5 minutes, which is plenty of time. But I think the audience in responding also has a responsibility to be polite and show some decorum.
Yeah, which again, I think is an educational question and a cultural question. Somehow, that's why I mentioned last week, and it takes 200 years to develop a robust democratic public discourse and 5 years to ruin it. Kind of a paraphrase of Warren Buffett's comment about reputation. What was shocking to me as someone who studied this for my whole adult life is how quickly that change seemed to take place. And all of a sudden you had groups on the scene that you'd never heard of that were controlling the discourse in some ways that were actually dangerous. But yes, we'll maybe have a little more time to talk about that next week. Okay, sources. Now, this is addressing directly the power imbalance I was talking about. And again, knowing how to phrase these sometimes is a bit of a challenge. Could somebody read that top paragraph for us? Sources should not enjoy greater power. Volunteer. If I knew all your names, I'd do it like in class. I was just calling you. Barbara.
Sources should not enjoy greater power simply because they are sources. While professional credentials enhance a source's credibility, sources do not, for this reason, negate the audience's, that is the public's, role as the final arbiter of morality and rationality in a democracy.
Now, that's a very weighted statement. The audience's role is to be the final arbiter of morality and rationality. Have you thought of audiences that way? Have you thought of yourself that way? The Supreme Court of these things is really not the Supreme Court. It's us. We're the arbiters of rationality and morality. Some of you are bringing this up already, saying, well, there's a certain way that they should respond. Well, that's kind of to talk about the morality of public discourse. So let's go on to number 3 here. Audiences have a right to freely decide in response to what they have heard or read. Now, what I mean is freely decide as in not manipulated, not intimidated, and not somebody else making the decision for them. Because, and here's the kind of radical, outrageous statement, the public's role as the final arbiter of morality and rationality in a democracy. I'd like to get a response or two to that statement, because that's a kind of radical, extreme statement in some people's books. And what is your name again? Jean? Okay, go ahead, Jean.
I totally lost my faith in the public over the last 6 years. I was so shocked. And first the election, but then the continuing.
You maybe we assumed some things and then realized we had no right to assume that. Maybe this is more a recovery group than a class right now.
That's like it unleashed something in the public, gave them
I
permission.
know. And that's why I said, how did that happen as fast as it did? Did we not value these things the way we thought we did? Or are we just 2 different publics or 3 or 4 different publics? And where did these guys come from?
Isn't there a reason though why the National Enquirer is still around and Maury Povich and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That there has been all along an audience for that kind of
Yes.
behavior.
Yes, and I think we relegated it to the fringe. We thought that was not serious mainstream, but they're there. Okay, freedom of speech, fine. But then all of a sudden they're there and they're inside the Capitol building. Okay, audiences. Okay, so here's the right of the audience to freely decide in response to what they've heard or read. Now, this sounds maybe sort of innocuous and, but anyone want to respond to that? This is my 3rd of 4 rights of the audience. To freely decide. If you're the decision makers, then there should be some protection for your right to make those decisions. And without manipulation, without coercion, without misinformation, disinformation. I know this is kind of a Don Quixote-ish and we're tilting at windmills here, but audiences have a right to freely decide. Anybody want to comment on that? Does that strike you as, it doesn't seem to me to be an extreme statement, but I think it sometimes today feels that way. George, Jen.
I'm going to try something here. It seems like in order to, instead of responding, we switch to a context that we can agree with. So we, instead of responding, having an actual, we choose our own radio stations to listen to. We choose the speaker we want to listen to. We choose the person we agree with. And instead of responding to the one that we don't agree with properly, we choose the one we do agree with.
That needs to be built into what I'm getting at here. So my theory is a little deficient in that area, but that's right. If you're only listening to a few sources or even one, then your decision-making has been interrupted, but it doesn't look like it has. So somehow we've got to broaden that input quite a bit as well. George, yes.
I'm thinking that this really points back to what we talked about last week in terms of manipulating audiences.
Yes.
If I were a different kind of preacher, I would tell folks, if you really love Jesus, you got to do thus and so.
Mm-hmm.
And it really takes away the freedom of the decision to decide, how they express that. I've already told them. And you do that in political realm when you say, if you're really an American, you fly the flag, you do this, you do that. And it puts a lot of pressure on people to respond in a certain way. Whereas you'd say, otherwise you'd say, these are, I think these are important values and things. And then people take it and make them their own whatever way they want.
Yes, and that's actually one reason for suggesting that we need to look at one another as decision makers and not just as passive recipients of ideas. I mean, that's where things really went haywire. Is if you see that audience as there to be manipulated by you because you know how to push their buttons, then you've already lost. And if we can re-elevate the audience, and I'll come back to that in just a few minutes. Anyone else want to comment on this idea?
A couple of things from Zoom.
Yeah.
A question is, how does the audience exercise that right? I'm pretty sure to freely decide. And our power as an audience is not equal to the speakers.
I think taking that as a matter of fact, not a preference, or that we just don't have. That's why you're tilting at the windmills, is to say, let's go back again and look at this and say, where did we go wrong? Can we reclaim some of this territory? So all I can say is, yes, point well taken. We got to try and change how we talk. Now, as a rhetorician, I'm all about how we talk. And so introducing some language like decision makers, power is in the hands of the audience, is actually one of my efforts to kind of counteract what the questioner is saying. And I take the point. Let me see if I can get this to change now again. Oops, not sure which side to push on this. Okay. Now, this is the last of my 4 rights of an audience. The quality of an audience will be, okay, here we go. This is the radical statement of a friend of mine. I'll introduce him to you if we have time here. We're going to have time. I'm going to ask someone to read the top paragraph. This is, I get chills when I read this. It may not happen to you, but go ahead, Bob.
The quality of an audience will determine the quality of the discourse presented to it.
Pause, full stop. Read that again, Bob.
The quality of an audience will determine the quality of the discourse presented to it.
Just got to let that reverberate in the room a little bit. This comes from a friend, not a friend of mine, one of my, not even a faculty member of mine. I'll just say someone I respect. I'll introduce you to him in the next slide or two. Go ahead and finish that paragraph, Bob.
Audiences can thus elevate or diminish a culture's discourse. As we should seek to keep going, or
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, as we should seek to elevate our discourse, or
go ahead.
Audiences have a right not to be tampered with.
Now, I brought up this idea last time. I don't know if this is the best wording, but I kind of like it. The right not to be tampered with, not to be kind of in some kind of sub rosa way affected in a negative, rationally negative direction. We'll come back to that, but look at the first sentence. If I asked you, who decides about the quality of discourse in a culture? It probably, first of all, the question would seem odd, like, well, I've never even thought about it that way. But let's think about it together. The quality of an audience will determine the quality of the discourse presented to it. You get the point. You think it sounds accurate. Is that the case? We've just been talking about the quality of discourse. We're kind of talking as if in different communities it changes quite a bit. And we might say, well, so let's take someone like Donald Trump. Is he? And I want to say, no, let's take his audiences. The quality of an audience will determine the quality of discourse presented to it. Does that seem, you're shaking your head no. Was that Barbara? Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Well, it seems to me that that first sentence is elitist as hell.
Mm-hmm.
I think when you look at a Trump audience, and part of the problem has been that many of those folks don't feel they have been spoken to with respect and with a recognition of what their true concerns are.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are, they're kind of hitting back because you're talking to me like the person who is now saying some what some of us consider very outrageous things
Mm-hmm.
is because it's what I've been thinking and have been written off. And
Okay.
so, nobody's really answering that question. They're simply dismissing me as not having half a brain. And that creates some problems.
Yeah, okay, good point. There's a hand up over here and also up front. Let's see what else. You're saying that's why they respond the way they do. Yeah, okay.
I think the quality of an audience isn't a fixed place.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's variable and that out of, say, a group of people that you can appeal to one part of their nature, or you can appeal to another part of their nature. And I think different people will do that, right? So I think that you can appeal to different sections, different, what am I trying to say? Different motives and different people, different ideation, and you can go higher or you can go lower, but I think the speaker can impact where the audience is given their discourse, what they say to them.
Yeah, and that's actually how we normally see it. In fact, that the speaker is kind of affecting the level of discourse by identifying certain audiences and appealing to them or not, or the audience is demanding a certain kind of response because they feel they've been mistreated. Yes.
I think there can be sort of the tail wagging the dog phenomenon also, where they take the temperature of a group of voters and say, if I'm going to capture this group of voters, then I'm going to have to be for this and against that. I'm going to have to hold up this book in public and not that book. Those kinds of things. So I think that part of it, what we're maybe bristling about a little bit here is the word quality.
Oh, okay. Well, and the idea here, I guess, is, and I think it's clear enough, is it's not speakers, but it's audiences. Now, we're so determined to think of the speaker as somehow deciding how they're going to. The question would be, if the audience demanded of the speaker a different type of discourse, could that potentially elevate the discourse? I don't know. You're shaking your head yes now, Barbara. Is that, you think you would agree with that? Okay. Beverly had her hand up. Yeah, Beverly.
We want our Zoomers to hear you.
I was just thinking about this. Would, instead of saying quality, maybe the knowledge base of the audience might be better?
Well, this is not my own term. It's actually a translation of a French term, and I'm going to get to that in a sec. Oh boy,
Okay.
I'm going to get into French. The quality here is how good is the discourse in terms of standards of rationality and morality, and the quality of that discourse, according to this turn I've just taken, is still with the audience. It's, if we could think of it as the audience is determining that quality, not the speaker, then if your favorite or some infamous politician showed up and he or she was not able to demand a certain kind of response from the audience because they were expecting something higher, something more demanding. That's kind of the idea of quality in this sense. So I don't know what would be a better phrase. I'll show you where it came from in just a sec. In fact, you'll go, oh, that's where it came from. Anyone else want to comment? Let's flip the slide here, I think. Oh, okay. Acts of audience tampering diminish the audience's quality as an audience. This is the, okay, so would you put a different word in there? The audience's quality as an audience, the audience's competence as an audience? You know what I'm getting at this point, I think. Yeah, okay, this is, so competent audiences are more important to a democracy than okay, now here's another one of these kind of big, exotic, outrageous statements. Competent audiences are more important to a democracy than our competent speakers or writers. If what we've been, yes. What's that? Oh. I'm having trouble. Left side. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Competent audiences are more important to a democracy than our competent speakers and writers. I put the exclamation point in there kind of joking, but I'm serious. That is not the way we're usually inclined to think about this. But I want to ask you if you think that's an accurate or inaccurate statement. We normally think it's the speakers. I last week said, go read Lincoln's second inaugural again if you haven't read it for a while. I'm not taking anything away from Lincoln or the second inaugural or his skill as a speaker. But if we think about it the way I've been building the case today, it actually would be the audience that's more important to democracy than a competent speaker. I'm reminded of a New Yorker cartoon where kind of a father and son out in some public space, and they're looking at a statue, and there are several men and women in a big circle facing each other on the statue. And the father says to the son, remember, son, there are no great people, only great committees. Now, we don't think about committees as where this all are groups of us. Who wants to respond? Bobby, you're trying to get the microphone there. Go ahead.
This again may be tangential, but it comes to mind. I'm wondering whether what you're talking about here regarding the concept of competent audiences is in some respects what was being debated amongst the founders 240 years ago about who should be allowed to vote. Namely, some who said, we don't trust the masses. And others said, those are the ones that we actually need to. But the compromise was, well, we're only going to trust white male landowners. They're the only ones that can truly have competency enough to vote so sustain a democracy. And we have moved away from that over the last 240 years. But I wonder whether that was part of the discussion that was an intense debate as to who can be considered a competent audience that will go to the voting booth.
That's probably why we have a bicameral approach to government. You had that buffering Senate there, so things didn't get out of hand, although it didn't look that way now. But yeah, that was actually part of the whole debate among the framers of the Constitution. Anyone else have a comment?
We have a couple longer comments from Zoom, so we
Okay.
might maybe do one, and then if someone else has a comment in the room, and then come back to Zoom. But one of them is, let's think about a person who sincerely believes that white or Christian people are superior to all other races or religions. They think that the new laws on affirmative actions are hurting their children and grandchildren. They may find an audience where a majority agree with them. How do you always find competent audiences? Not all audiences are created equal.
Yeah, and that's why I'm going to come down again on the side of education. I don't think this just happens because someone like me says that we should do it that way. I think it's the beginning of an agenda, and the agenda has, I said last week, one of my concerns was moving away from the teaching of critical thinking. I don't think if we all learn critical thinking, that would solve the problem either, but it would get us closer to a solution. So I would agree with that, and yet say it's just the beginning of an agenda building project. Is that okay for now, do you think?
I believe so.
You said there were two, but you want to come back to you?
I can ask the next one, or if someone else wants to comment now. I'll go ahead. Okay, so second question. When I think about manipulations of audiences and the rights and powers of audiences, I keep returning to the success of advertising, the now understood powers of messaging to influence and even control the responses of their audiences. This pits the power of manipulative discourse, advertising, against the power of audiences to reject or walk out on presenters.
Okay, I'm going to recommend a book because that's a very big domain of advertising, and can you resist advertising or can't you, and what do you do in response? The book title is one word, Influence. The author is Robert Cialdini, Cialdini, who's at the University of Arizona, and Cialdini knows more about this kind of thing than anybody I've run into. I'm just going to say I'll recommend the book by Cialdini, but he thinks audiences always have the capacity to respond, even when they're being manipulated. And I'm going to mention another book called Arguing and Thinking, and it's by an author named Michael Billig, B-I-L-L-I-G. It's not a new book, it's been out for 30 years, but it's on the idea of two-sided communication in the rhetorical domain. Billig is the best I've found, and I think both of those, Cialdini's Influence, Billig's Arguing and Thinking, are really good sources on that question, which is a very big question. Okay, let me see what else. Okay, now, what am I going to do next here? Audience tampering. Okay, let's try this. Here are some examples when I say audience tampering, because that was the last one I dealt with, kind of fourth in the line of the rights of audiences. Number one, denying access to or discouraging education and critical reading and listening skills. Now, this is kind of, we've been circling around all for the last two sessions. I've said we're backing away from it. I don't understand all the reasons we are, but education has become a very tumultuous arena for us again. Number two, threatening or otherwise intimidating audience members. This is tampering with an audience. because they are the decision makers and ultimate arbiters of rationality and morality. Number 3, encouraging bad listening and reading practices, some of which we've actually been talking about today. But for example, dismissing whole groups of people by labeling them in one way or another would be encouraging bad listening and reading practices. Number 4, propagating disinformation. And number 5, denying access to credible evidence. Now, this is just not random, but just kind of the ones that I felt had to be on the list. You've got the idea of audience tampering. Is there anything there, anything not there that you would add to that list? Or is there anything that you think maybe doesn't belong on the list? And again, how am I reasoning about this? If this is one of the rights of an audience, they should not be tampered with. We have to define that term tampering. And this is one of my efforts to do that. Anyone want to respond to the list? Bob?
Under number 2, Jim, would you consider the effort to restrict voting to fall under that category, that there is a threatening or intimidating dynamic of we're not going to let you go easily to the vote or to the voting booth, or if you're in line, anybody who gives you water is prosecutable, that this indeed actually is a formalized way of intimidating the audience?
Well, yes, I would say yes. And they're actually arguing that giving them water is tampering with them, you know, kind of giving them the capacity to stay a little longer in line. But yes, I mean, that'd be my response. Anyone else have a comment? Yeah, Barbara. There you go.
I think number 1 should read, rather than denying access, but rather insisting that access and education in critical reading and listening skills are mandatory.
Yeah, I would too.
I mean,
Yeah, I agree with you. And as I said, this is kind of an agenda setting exercise. And I'm kind of trying to couch these in ways that at least at first, they wouldn't just be immediately rejected. But I mean, my whole career was spent teaching critical thinking, and I'm certainly an advocate for that. It would make it a stronger than just a suggestion, like it sounds here. Anyone else want to? Okay, now let's see where we're at. Audience tampering. Now, I never know what's going to come up here. Does that say developing audience? Okay, developing audience competence requires an educational agenda. Yay. Okay, now I'm going to give you a real quick overview of kind of my approach to critical thinking, but there are lots of ways of going about this. What should, say, maybe you're in middle school or maybe you're retired, you know, you still need to be able to do these things to be a competent member of a competent audience that's raising the bar on public discourse. Number 1, the ability to recognize a claim, and not just an assertion, but a claim. And the claim is recognized because it needs some evidence. Second point, the capacity to evaluate evidence, not just to listen to it, but to actually evaluate it. Number 3, to understand the need for evidence as support for claims. Now, I have validity in parentheses there because technically, in the field of logic, to get from evidence to a claim as support for that evidence, or as a derivative of that evidence, has been treated under the heading of validity, and that's a big field, and I don't have time to stop and talk about any of these, which is probably to your advantage today. But we have concern for evidence, concern for the evidence, the way you connect evidence to a claim. And then number 4, understand the role of definition. Now, this is what I tell my students, kind of the invisible criterion. When somebody says, here's what I mean as an example, I don't want to get too animated because these get pretty close to home sometimes. If somebody says deep state, I want us to hold up a stop sign and say, define that. I mean, because if you haven't defined the term, I don't have any idea what you're talking about, right? So that would just be an example. The idea is that in a debate or in any public speaking or public discourse setting, terms have to be clearly defined and consistently defined, meaning once you've entered a certain definition, you can't change it without telling the audience you changed it. And number 5, the ability to recognize and counteract audience tampering, which is an ethical concern. So we have support validity, linguistic consistency, and ethics. Now, that slide by itself kind of suggests a whole educational agenda. And I'm not, of course, going to develop that today, but that would be kind of the approach. Now, it may not be what you would identify, and that's fine. I'd rather people would be given this a try, whatever their system was. But this is the system I've used in class and talked about with students. It's worked pretty well with my students. Anyone want to comment on the audience competency requirements? What would you have on that list that may not be there if we think in specific terms about, now as an educator, I can think about it as an educational project. You could think of it as an interpersonal project. That would be hard to accomplish. Anyone think there's some point that's not there, Amy?
Just the second one, the capacity to evaluate evidence. As a psychology minor at Hope College, I learned the difference between correlation and cause and effect.
Causation, yeah.
And that I think that that's an important distinction that people need to make when they're evaluating things, but I'm not sure very many folks.
Well, it would be that kind of thing. And if you get Cialdini's book, that's one of the areas he puts a lot of emphasis on. There are different vocabularies, there are different approaches. What you have to be cautious of is no approach at all, because then it's just intuition. And our intuition is pretty malleable, I think, at times. But yes, I mean, what's the difference between correlation and causation? Would be one of the many things that you have to go into. Anyone else have a comment on that list? Now, I have a question for you at this point. It's 2:00. I want to introduce you to this guy. Whoops. This guy. Do you have another 15 minutes of listening ability in reserve? Okay. Now this, you weren't expecting this. This is my second picture in these two presentations. That man's name is Chaim Perlman. Perlman is no longer living. He died in 1984. Who is he? And why did I bring him up? Perlman is a Belgian attorney who was born in Poland in a Jewish family, emigrated to Brussels when he was about 13 in the mid-20s, and spent his whole life studying the issue of law and justice and audience. Now, I bring Perlman up to you. I actually met Perlman on a couple of different occasions, once at the University of California, once at the University of Wisconsin. I wrote my master's thesis on his work. So I'm pretty familiar with Chaim Perlman. And most people who are familiar with him find him pretty tedious and boring. I never shared that opinion of him, but there you have it. Now, the quality of the audience determines the quality of the discourse. Where have you heard that before? Earlier today. That was not from me, that was from Chaim Perlman, and a book called The New Rhetoric. Now, what's the story on the New Rhetoric? Perlman fought in the Belgian resistance in World War II, and after the war was over, he was shocked that the standard sources of ethical guidelines in European culture had been blasted to oblivion and didn't seem to put any meaningful restriction on anybody's activities, and he was determined to come up with a solution to the problem of value and morality that didn't require an ideology and didn't require a religion. Now, I'm bringing this up kind of as a footnote to intellectual history, but also to give you some idea of where I started out with this, because I found Perlman actually inspirational. Let's see. Now, Perlman said, okay, if we're going to return to some kind of standard of morality and rationality, where are we going to find that? We're not going to find it in a religion. That didn't work. Now, I'm not saying you should accept Perlman's conclusion. He was an atheist for most of his adult life. We're not going to find it in an ideology like National Socialism or communism. Where are we going to find it? Well, his answer to that question was you find it in the audience. And this is where I started out. Oh, Janet, did you meet Perlman when he was on the Davis campus? Okay. I wrote my dissertation on, MA thesis on Perlman. He showed up the day I was going to defend it. And he said to me in his broken English, "Oh, I will come to your defense this afternoon." Scared the heck out of me. And when he left the room, my advisor, Michael Leff, said, "That'll teach you to write about living authors." Okay, so this is Perlman's idea. Audiences establish standards of discourse and audiences evaluate the merits of discourse. Now this, nobody had said anything like this. Audience studies had all been about adaptation to the audience's values, et cetera. So Aristotle and the rhetoric has a whole bunch of stuff on audience analysis, but it's not for this reason. It's so you can be a more persuasive speaker, to empower the speaker. Perlman's idea was to empower the audience. And I found it intriguing at the time, and I still do. Audiences establish standards of discourse and audiences evaluate the merits of discourse. We've kind of been there already. I'm just now showing you where it came from. Audiences, not sources, are thus the foundation of a reasonable public sphere. Now, that term public sphere comes from another European author named Jürgen Habermas, and he's a more familiar name than Perlman. But there's the original source. That's as pure as I can get it in terms of where this came from. Anybody want to react to, or maybe we already had a chance to react to, audiences, not sources, are the foundation of a reasonable public sphere. Yeah, David.
There is a comment from Zoom, which was from a little bit ago, but I think it applies now as well. Self-respect is important to each audience's competency.
Yes, and I think to be treated with respect is all part of this, and that's part of elevating the discourse and elevating the audience, which is one reason that some of the things we've seen recently have been so dangerous and so damaging. It doesn't take long to dismantle an audience's sense of self-respect. Anyone else? Yeah, Suzanne. The microphone is coming.
Suzanne here again. That's why the politicians need the audience.
Go ahead. Did you, okay, yeah, well, no, I agree. I mean, that's kind of the center of this, that.
And then
if
it's
we-
considered a reasonable public sphere.
Yes, right. It's the audience that establishes how reasonable that public sphere is going to be. And I think you're right. There has to be the humility, which we're going to get to in just a sec. The humility to say, I need some help from my audience. Where do I go with this? Anyone else want to comment on that? So do we have speakers depending on audiences? Now, there's a good reason they would. Let's see. Perlman's audience-based, so this is just an announcement. We're going to look at Perlman's audience-based approach to evaluating arguments. Now, you're some of the few people in the world who've heard Perlman's system, so you're responsible for this now. The audience, okay, here's what Perlman did. Perlman said, well, let's put some flesh on these bones. What are we talking about? Well, Perlman said, if you think about it, and this is just one little corner of his work, but it's an important corner. How many audiences are there? Let's start with one, the audience of the self. When you look in the mirror, you see an audience? What did he mean by that? One cannot fail to be honest with oneself. Now, what he really had in mind here is that if you want to be reasonable, if you want a reasonable public sphere, you got to start at home. It's got to start with you. And one of the ways of doing that, of getting closer to it, is to ask yourself about the arguments that you accept. Are there any flaws in those arguments? And if there are, where are they? What do you think of this idea of the audience? Talking to yourself. Well, in a way, he was advocating talking to yourself. Yeah, David?
We have a question. How will an audience know when it is a quote quality audience?
Well, I don't know that they will know that. You'll just kind of sense it happening. I mean, this has to take place culturally over quite a long period of time. I actually think we know when we don't have a reasonable public sphere. Are we going to know when we have a reasonable public sphere? I don't have a good answer to that, but that's a good question. Anyone else want to comment on one cannot fail to be honest with oneself about your arguments? Some people would say, no, of course, we delude ourselves all the time. And Perlman's saying, no, give yourself a little more credit than that. You can tell, and you know in your heart of hearts when you're harboring some unreasonable idea and you should disabuse yourself of it. What do you think? This is only stage one in a several stage process, but the audience of the self. George, do you think you can't be dishonest with yourself, or you can? Okay.
That gut feeling.
Because I know how easy it is to fool yourself.
Yes. But if you practice this, which I think Perlman has in mind, put on your guard, try to disabuse yourself of your own biases for a while and ask yourself, would you buy that argument, in your best mind that you can imagine? Someone else had their hand up. Let's go on to the next one, see where he's going with this. The audience of one. Okay, now this is a little easier to comprehend in some ways. A single skilled interlocutor can serve as a test of the reasonableness of one's argument. Okay, do you have a friend? Maybe it's not a friend. Maybe it's just somebody who agrees to do this, that you could go to and say, and would you say, listen, I'm going to try this out on you. Where are the flaws in my thinking when I say this? Now, if you say, well, I'm just going to go to people that agree with me, probably not going to help too much. But he really was serious about this. As a single skilled interlocutor can serve as a test of the reasonableness of one's arguments. A conversation, an honest conversation with one other person, and you're actually, the rules of the game are, you tell me where I'm wrong. What do you think of that? What is your name? In between Beverly and Suzanne here. Yeah, I was just wondering what your name was. Marilyn. Oh, Marilyn. Well, do you have any thoughts in response to this? Could a single skilled conversation partner can help?
Yes, I think so.
Would you be willing to try that? Or
Am I willing to try that?
I don't mean you and me right now, but do you think that would you be willing to try it and, like identify someone you consider to be a rational person and try your arguments out on them?
Sure. Mhm.
Yeah.
Why not?
Okay. Yeah. Well, some people would be intimidated by the process, but anyone else want to comment on that?
The value of this is that you can talk yourself into anything in your own head, but once it comes out and you start verbalizing it, then it's put to the test.
I think that's what he's got in mind. Yes. And also that unless we're willing to take some of these risks, things are not going to change. They're going to stay just as they are, which also requires some honesty here in finding if you were going to do this. And I have someone in mind, a friend of mine in Tennessee. I think I could ask Russell. He'd be honest with me. Is this a good position, a bad position? Am I making sense? Am I not making sense? Let's see what else Perlman had to suggest here. Okay, the particular audience, if you think back to that original slide I showed you of people sitting in a room, that's the audience we normally think of. That's the group that the speaker or source is addressing at the particular time. And Perlman said, among other things about the particular audience, they represent the community's values, so it's a crucial component in public discourse. Someone said, someone might say, well, that's elitist. Well, this is a Perlman's effort to bring it down to the realm where it's not elite. This is your particular audience. You can't just ignore the people sitting there en masse and say, well, I could manipulate them if I needed to. All I have to do is get them to vote for me. Well, Perlman said, if you think about it, this is where we have a connection to the community's values, which developed over a very long period of time. And it's a crucial component in public discourse. So you have to be able to persuade not only the audience of self, the audience of one, but the particular audience as well. Any response to that comment? How about the comment that the audience represents the values of the community? Now, on January 6th, politicians were addressing a particular audience who was right there with them. Somebody has said there are many different audiences. Is Perlman right here? Audiences represent community values? Particular audiences? Can you think of an example where you'd say yes to that question? I think this audience does in some ways represent. Do they perfectly codify it? No. Do they capture all of it? No. But they're there because they represent something that's taken a long time to develop, which is the values that define this community. What does that bring to mind for you? Yeah, Suzanne?
Look at religion.
Uh-huh.
How many are there?
Yeah, and actually, I think he's saying, if this operates, say, on the ground in a particular location or a particular religion dominates, that's okay with me. If you've gone through the rest of the process, you need to know what those particular audience members believe. You can't dismiss them. So I think he would say, that's okay. as long as you're engaging them with this kind of respect, that they have the values of the community in their heads, in their hearts. Did you have some other thought on that or response to that? I think I know what you're saying. How would you know which community and which values out of all of these? Yeah, Bob?
Thank you. With regard to religious values as a good example of how the audience needs to engage, I'm wondering whether that particular area, namely religious values as we know it even in the last 5 to 20 years, is in such flux in our society that, for example, those who are 20s and in their 30s are in huge numbers leaving the institutional church, questioning what traditional religious values were that they were raised in as kids, that their grandparents have, that part of the audience is in such enormous change that it's difficult to establish what the values are of the audience.
Yeah, which may mean you have to do this periodically. It's not a done deal once it's done. Am I thinking of the right book? C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man. I think at the end of that book, he steps out of the evangelical frame. And has anybody read that book, The Abolition of Man? And at the end, he says, he tries to identify universal, coherent religious values. Now, he got a lot of criticism for that. He called it the Tao, T-A-O. And the book's only about 60 pages total. And it's really just the kind of the appendix at the end in which he does this. But he was, I think, trying to respond to this idea that it's all diversity and it's all changing and in flux. And Lewis says, well, if you look historically and look cross-culturally, there are some values that are pretty much agreed upon over long periods of time. You could take a look at that and see if you agree with him. Yeah.
So we have a couple sort of two-parter from Zoom.
Okay.
Some people blatantly lie for political gain. I would say look at Mitch McConnell, many folks who wish to be elected with Trump's blessing, MTG, many others. If you know in your heart you are lying and you go ahead and lie and lie and lie anyway, how does this argument help prevent another Holocaust? And then on the subject of, I think, particular audiences, what if this particular audience is all wearing white hoods with beaks?
Well, this is back to the idea of raising the quality of discourse. And Perlman would say, and he's being idealistic, but I'm with him on this. If you actually are honest about it and ask, we're going to get the kind of big point at the next slide, but you would have less of that if you had more of this. So if there's more earnest self-examination on the question of, and if you saw the public as decision makers and the audience as the ones who raise and lower the standards of discourse, I think he'd say to that, you just allowed somebody to lower the standard of discourse about as far as it can go. But if you had periodically been examining the question in this method I'm talking about, you'd have less of this. Now, is that idealistic? You bet it is. But we got to be kind of idealistic about some of this, or just at sea. Was there another question there? Okay, now let's see what the point that really was kind of controversial in his system was this one called the universal audience. And this will be the last point today. This is his effort to address the question that Dave just read from the Zoom session. Now, this is imagined. An imagined audience of highly rational persons representing universal standards of reason and morality. Now, he actually believed that you could come up with some vision of the universal audience. Why? Well, you need to, because otherwise you're left with the values of the particular audiences, which are partly temporal, they're frozen in time, spatial, they're frozen in geography, and you have to elevate the discourse to this point. If you imagine the most rational people you could imagine being in the room, like this group in here today, this would work as a universal audience. He's saying you have to pass muster with that group too. Your best conception of the best human beings you can imagine have to be persuaded by the idea that you're working through. Now, I've said, yes, he was idealistic. It's kind of funny because he didn't give you this idea at all of being a kind of dreamy, intuition-driven person. He was pretty hard-nosed academic and attorney. But this is the idea he brought up everywhere he went. He, in fact, he was famous for saying, isn't anyone going to ask me about the universal audience? Because people sometimes thought, oh no, that's all he talks about. What do you think of this idea that part of improving public discourse would be we put ourselves through the exercise of imagining, appealing to a group of highly rational, highly moral people to see if they would accede to our ideas? What do you think? I've seen a lot of inquisitive looks out there. Is Perlman right?
I think rationality and morality are things that I used to know what they were. I feel like now it's sort of like people's focus is, can I be famous? Can I, make a YouTube video that a lot of people will watch?
Right.
I mean, so what people value, I'm not sure really is reason and morality. There's certainly some of us who still believe in that, but I'm not sure that's actually
So
is a universal standard.
The
anymore.
question is, would this be part of a process of turning the corner and reorienting ourselves so that we could reclaim some of that lost territory? And I think that was, look, I mean, Perlman watched Nazism to take, swath across Europe. He was no undiagnosed optimist, but at the same time, he believed this, that you could, if we really tried culturally, we could reclaim the territory, but you're not going to do it by looking to famous leaders, okay? You're not going to do it by looking to monolithic religious traditions, and you're certainly not going to do it by looking at destructive ideology. So where do you find it? This, by the way, is saying, I put my confidence in ordinary people, because he's not saying educated members of the Supreme Court are picking the universal audience. He's saying you're coming up with it yourself, which I think is a pretty high compliment to the audience of ordinary people, citizens. But I agree. Could we reclaim? So the New Rhetoric, his book called The New Rhetoric, came out in French in 1959, came out in English in 1969. About the time I was going into grad school, I started grad school in 1976. It was just hitting American shores. Europeans dismissed him. They didn't want anything to do with Perlman. He found friendly audience in American academic, in American universities. So he was over here a lot, which is why I met him. But he would have agreed with that. He had been disabused of any kind of idealistic thinking. Anyone else want to respond to making the effort? Could we do it? Yeah, George.
Yeah, this may be a little bit of a stretch, but looking through these 4 points, it just kind of strikes me as something like this is behind some of the great speeches that we remember, or the ones that we have to read when we're studying civics or American history, or maybe some of Martin Luther King's more inspirational speeches.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree.
That are very much rooted in the reality before them, but are holding something much better before us.
And attentive to the audience's values. I mean, that's one of the real striking things about the great orators like Lincoln or King. Anyone else want to comment? In fact, I think the two people that you mentioned, and that we could make a list of our most inspirational speakers, they're always this kind of person. They're always very attentive to the audience, very aware of the public's mind, and wanting to appeal to, as Lincoln said, the better angels of our nature. Any other? Oh, look, we're almost done here, or we are. Yeah, go ahead. What is your name again? Oh, how did I forget? Oh man, am I going to have to answer for that later on? Okay.
This is just a plug. But since voting is the ultimate response of the audience of public discourse, I have an opportunity today, if anybody wants to sign a petition to get putting voters' rights into the Michigan Constitution.
Great. Okay. So there's a plug for signing the petition to get voters' rights protected in the Michigan Constitution.
In the Michigan Constitution. This
Okay.
just gets it on the ballot. Then the voters have to decide if they want to adopt.
And
it.
this is something I'm not addressing, which is the actual actions of citizens to put some flesh on these bones. Yeah.
Right. And we're about to have some of our voters' rights taken away from us in the state of Michigan.
Okay.
So
All right. Thank you for that, Janet. Okay, now I'm going to call time unless somebody has another comment, and I appreciate this is not easy stuff. It may not even all be accurate, but it's, I think, worth thinking about. And I appreciate Perlman's effort to turn the corner, to redirect the kind of flow culturally. And I'm convinced we got to do that again. We got to at least make the effort. This is kind of my shot at that. And next week, I want to take us out. We went from conspiracy theories out to the rights of the audience. We're going to go out a little further and talk about some virtues that we need to cultivate in the audiences to help them achieve this level of quality of discourse Perlman was talking about. And I call those the virtues of discourse. Okay, that's all I have for today. Thanks for your attention. It's a long session, and thank you, Amy, for moving the microphone around professionally. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's good, great class.
And thanks, Janet, for bringing the materials with you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.